As supporters of the PerthUSAsia Center will know, we were scheduled on the 8th of April to host both a roundtable discussion and a public lecture with Professor Rory Medcalf, head of the National Security College at the Australian National University and author of a new volume, Contest for the Indo-Pacific, Why China Won't Map the Future. There was tremendous interest in these events. I think both the lunch and the roundtable were immediately fully subscribed. Unfortunately, in the current era, we are now moving as we promised to do things virtually. We are happy to report that today, Professor Medcalf has agreed to join us for an online discussion. This is a poor substitute to having him here in Western Australia in person, but we thought it would be a great opportunity to, at least without waiting too much longer, share the initial findings of this book with you, our audience here in Western Australia, and those who are watching from abroad as well. So, Rory, thank you. Welcome. We appreciate you joining us.
Thanks indeed, Gordon.
Now, in this community and to our audience, Rory really needs no introduction. He's been out here numerous times before. He's been one of the keynote speakers at our In the Zone conference. In fact, was largely responsible for the framing of that conference from its inception back in 2009. He was a keynote speaker at our WA Indo-Pacific Defense conferences and has given several previous speeches out here on the Indo-Pacific. In fact, those of you who have followed the PerthUSAsia Center for the last 6+ years will know that almost every event we do, we frame around the Indo-Pacific. And so in this, we owe a tremendous debt of gratitude to Professor Medcalf. Probably more than any other scholar in Australia and probably globally, he has been responsible for not just popularizing the term Indo-Pacific, but thinking through what it really means for policymakers. When his book was launched in Canberra last month, it is an indication of how much regard that he is held in personally and the book is held in, that it was launched jointly by the current Foreign Minister of Australia, Senator Marise Payne, and the Shadow Foreign Minister of Australia, Senator Penny Wong. And in fact, in launching it, Senator Payne mentioned that the Australian government has probably been using the term Indo-Pacific almost as long as Rory has. We here recognize that success has many fathers. We note that it was our own board member, Stephen Smith, the first government official in the region to put it in an official document that included in the 2013 Foreign Policy White Paper. We also acknowledge that Foreign Minister Julie Bishop, also from here in WA, led a foreign policy white paper process. Rather, earlier I was talking about the defense policy white paper, that used the Indo-Pacific as a framing document. In this discussion, and one that Rory has led for a long time, just to introduce our speaker, and again, I think he needs no introduction. Rory, in addition to leading the National Security College at ANU since 2015, was the founding director of the International Security Program at the Lowy Institute, was previously a diplomat for Australia, also worked at the Office of National Assessment, which is now the Office of National Intelligence, but really has been thinking through what the Indo-Pacific means for us and these broader strategic trends. And so to have his latest volume drop is something that's of great excitement to us and to hopefully those of you who are watching this. What we'd like to do today is ask Rory just to give some framing comments, maybe 5 or 10 minutes of what drove him to write the book, what we need to most understand about it. I will then do as best I can to channel you in our community in asking 4 or 5 questions, and then we'll wrap it up there. So Rory, if I could, again, thank you for doing this and turn the time over to you just to kind of frame the book itself.
Well, Gordon, thank you for that kind introduction and the chance to talk about the book, Contest for the Indo-Pacific, which is also now being released internationally with a different title, which we may come to. So, look, in this very challenging time in the global strategic situation, it's worth taking a long view. And really, the intent of this book has been to capture the way the region around Australia and the Asia-centric maritime region that is still so important to the global future, to track the way this region has evolved over the long turbulence of history and to put down some markers for how this regional order may develop into the future and how this may be managed. And much of that is to do with Chinese power, not all to do with Chinese power. So the first thing I note is it's important to look beyond the present, because we are going to have obviously a very disrupted phase ahead where we need to question a lot of the strategic truths, including about the Indo-Pacific that we've been working on for some years. But bear in mind also that this region, this multipolar region, seems to have a special character to it, one that discourages hegemony and empowers many players. The book reflects, I guess, a lot of the thinking that I and others have been doing on this new Indo-Pacific concept, not so new anymore, but this fresh Indo-Pacific concept that I think in many ways has replaced the late 20th century Asia-Pacific concept for framing policy. A few really important markers, and I really would like shortly, Gordon, if I may, to inflict some maps on our viewers, because the book is very much about maps. And if you see, not only is there a pivoted map of Australia's region on the cover, but of course, as we work through, and as you'll see, there are maps old and indeed maps new that have something to say about the book. The book argues that foreign and security and indeed economic policy at some level can be framed through mental maps. In other words, the cartographic templates that leaders have in their minds when they think about what is the region, who is in, who is out, who are our friends, who are our partners, who are prospective adversaries, what are the vectors of risk, what are the chains of connectivity. And the Indo-Pacific concept, which the book reflects, is not to say that there is some sort of alternative framing of the world that excludes China, which is one of the misinterpretations about the Indo-Pacific, but rather that the past few decades of rapidly expanding connectivity, much of it coming out of China or China-centric, and rapidly expanding contestation among many countries, not just China and the United States. This has repositioned many of our nations in an Indo-Pacific region, a two-ocean region. And in the book, and I'll hope to inflict this on your viewers in a moment, there are maps that I think tell the story of how our thinking about the region has evolved. The first, I guess, map that is worth thinking about is that as far back as the medieval period, the 1400s, Asia was being considered as really a relatively unified, relatively maritime region, and a region which was not centred on one power like China, but in fact where there were multiple power centres, many belts and many roads, many links of connectivity. So in fact, I refer to a Korean map from around the early 1400s to capture a little bit of that story. It's also worth going back earlier to note that the norm for our region was in fact not the relatively recent, somewhat artificial notion of the Asia-Pacific that was useful for policymakers in the late 20th century because it connected North America to Asia, among other things, but rather an idea of two-ocean connectivity across the Indian and the Pacific Oceans, going to prehistoric, if you like, times where there was a kind of proto-economy of migration and trade among the maritime peoples, centred often on Southeast Asia, through to recorded history, in other words, the spread of Hinduism, of Buddhism, later of Islam, and the partial spread of a Chinese tributary system, which never quite dominated the Indian Ocean, certainly not for any length of time. And then, of course, moving to, I think, one of the most important maps of the book, the beginning of the European colonial or imperial era in the late 1400s and the 1500s, where, yes, to some degree, connectivity between Asian societies was damaged or broken by European colonialism and all of its negatives. But at the same time, maritime Asia became more connected to global systems of strategy and commerce. And that reflected really right through to the 20th century. So the book makes the argument that the norm for this region has been multipolar, has been maritime, and has been about Asia, about maritime Asia, but not maritime Asia in isolation, connecting maritime Asia with North America, with Europe, with Australia, with the Middle East, with Africa. That's been a kind of perennial centre of gravity economically and strategically for our region. And that's useful for policymakers at one level, because it suggests that we're in fact returning, or at least in the past 20 years, we've returned to a long-term norm for the region with all of the complexities and the opportunities that brings. And so the book progresses through a series of mental maps of the region, including, as I've mentioned, the fantastic visualisation from 1570 of the Dutch mapmaker Ortelius, who captured all of the Indo-Pacific, maritime Asia, and the United States, and even America in a single frame, complete with sea monsters and mermaids, mythical touches that are no more mythical, of course, than the 9-dash line. But then moving to the present day, where the Australian government in 2013 was the first in the world to formally redefine the region as the Indo-Pacific, and did this with a very powerful map, a representation of the connectivity of energy and trade through the sea lanes that leads us to the present day. A couple of final thoughts, Gordon, before I maybe go back to you for the conversation. And that is to look at the policy implications of this. What does this mean for decision makers in government, and indeed in private industry as well in the world today? A few things. One is, the book is, I hope, a corrective to the view that the history of our region has been essentially a China-centric history, which is the view that the PRC spends about $10 billion a year in promoting. Of course, China matters and was prominent in many parts of the Indo-Pacific throughout history, but typically it wasn't dominant across the broad region. It was one of a number of poles of interest and power. And that's really important as we try to come to terms with how to deal with China into the future. The book, despite its somewhat provocative subtitle, Why China Won't Map the Future, is not an anti-China book. It's a book instead that positions China in a multipolar region where, if you look a few decades ahead, and even despite, I think, the great convulsions that coronavirus is going to bring for the next who knows how many months or years to the global economy, nonetheless, over the medium to long term, there are still going to be these other power centres in the Indo-Pacific. You know, think of Japan, think of Southeast Asia, think of India, and think of the way that the global system will connect with the Indo-Pacific. So the book is a reminder that we have to make policy in a multipolar setting, in a maritime setting, and in a setting where, in fact, it's going to be in China's interest in the long run that other countries set limits to China's power and influence and ambitions across the region, and that we work together towards a kind of strategic settling point, so that, in a sense, China doesn't discover the hard way that this is a region where ultimately, I guess, hubris or neo-colonial ambitions come to crisis or failure. I'll leave it there, and I'd love to get into a conversation with you about a few of these elements.
Thank you, Rory. That was a wonderful summary, and I think it probably entices most of those listening right now to actually go out and buy the book. I'll mention it at the end as well, but we'll be putting a hyperlink to where you can purchase the book if you don't already have a copy yourselves going forward.
It's the ideal companion to self-isolation.
That is indeed. I can think of few books that you'd better spend your time reading in what is going to be a lot of time at home in the coming weeks and months. We institutionally are striving to focus on trying not to have our institutional narrative be dominated by the coronavirus. But at the same time, I thought I might kind of get that question out of the way early.
Mm.
Much of the narrative around the Asia-Pacific in the last century and the Indo-Pacific right now has been driven by connectivity and driven by globalization, driven by the presumption that the kind of the economic center of gravity has been shifting as Asia further integrates going forward. So if I can kind of start out with the coronavirus question, obviously it's not a word that came out in your book that you weren't anticipating when you launched it, and you've had to cancel this global book tour in promoting this book. But it seems to me that there are some fundamental questions being raised now, perhaps a little bit early, about globalization, about integration, that would kind of go to the heart of your book. So can we address that one first and foremost?
Yeah, look, absolutely. And look, interestingly, this book went to print in January at a time when perhaps not even the Chinese leadership knew the full extent of what it was about to have on its hands. I do make the point in the final chapter of the book that that one of the reasons why China's attempts, I think, or China's imperative, I should say, to try to dominate the region is going to be challenged is through strategic shocks, black swans, black elephants, as they're called. And indeed, I make this very passing reference towards the end of the book to pandemics as an opportunity to, I guess, transcend strategic competition and build partnership with China or whoever else. Now, of course, at the moment, we're not seeing that happening, and we're seeing, in fact, the worsening of US-China tensions. And I think also, despite China's propaganda efforts, the long-term worsening of a lot of mistrusts between China and some of its other partners. Let's see how that plays out. It is important, I agree, not to look at all of our long-term analysis through the lens of the crisis of the moment, although this particular crisis is going to have much larger, I think, repercussions than most crises of the moment. And I just go back to that historical view of the book. When I set out to write this book, I wasn't planning to make it essentially 50% a history book. And indeed, the first half of the book is basically an alternative history of maritime Asia over the past few thousand years. That turned out to be the most fun part of the book to research and to write. And in some ways, that will be the most enduring part of the book, no matter what happens in the medium to short term. I would say, though, that a few of the core judgments about the Indo-Pacific region are likely to hold true, and some of the strategic challenges and opportunities, particularly for middle players, for democracies, for countries like Australia, those are going to hold true as well. That is, whatever China or indeed the United States make or fail to make out of the current situation, middle players that are neither the US or China, but are actually quite substantial in their own right. For example, Australia, Japan, India, Indonesia, Vietnam, the list goes on. These players are essentially going to not only have to look to their own devices more, but are going to be encouraged to seek more solidarity with one another. There was already a push against the over-reliance of a number of our economies on China in our supply chains, in our economic relationships. Even if and as China seeks to get its domestic house in order again and to become a manufacturing hub again, there's likely to be a greater imperative and a necessity to diversify supply chains. That's one point. The second point to note is that a lot of these other powers are going to be really looking to how they can combine what I would call a sanctuary approach to their security, that is looking to the advantages of geography, maritime geography, with a networked approach, looking for friends and like-minded countries in increasingly distant locations. And one of the core arguments of the Indo-Pacific is that as China's interests and presence have expanded into the Indian Ocean, South Asia, and Africa and the Middle East, through the so-called maritime Silk Road, the Indo-Pacific with Chinese characteristics, so too has the playing field competition and cooperation expanded for all of us. And that actually, in a sense, makes it easier for countries like Australia to build relations with others like India or even France and some of the Europeans who we would not have seen automatically in the old 20th century Asia-Pacific frame of reference as being our natural partners. And so I think that search for a broader range of like-mindeds will go on. Going finally to the one of the really intriguing parts of your question, and that is, what is this going to do to China's own, I guess, wider regional ambitions? The Belt and Road, the Indo-Pacific with Chinese characteristics. Look, it's very difficult to see China winding back from those ambitions anytime soon. And in some ways, especially through the narrative battle now, China will double down on those ambitions. But I do think that the internal tensions in China that the book highlighted, particularly what we've seen in recent years with not only dissent in places like Hong Kong, but also a recognition in China that as the demographics change in China and China's working age population continues to diminish, the expense of the Belt and Road, the expense of a global military footprint is going to affect China just as much as it affects any other power. And so I still see this almost half-hearted attempt at Chinese empire continuing over the next few decades. I certainly see question marks over the kind of role the United States will play. But importantly, this book is not about the United States somehow regaining global leadership and primacy in all areas, nor is it about, as I think one critic has mistakenly assumed, the straw man of India stepping in to become the new regional and global leader. It's a book about the messiness and complexity of multipolarity and how small and middle powers can play that to their advantage. And I think that argument will hold true.
Well, thank you. Let's go, if we could, to that straw man. A simplistic reading of the Indo-Pacific is that at its core, or at least in priority, it's about how do you integrate a rising India into the Asia-Pacific. Now, obviously, it's much more complex than that. But you did reference, colleagues of yours across campus, putting up a straw man suggesting that India will never be the great contester of China that we hope it to be. That does seem to be a misreading of kind of your core argument. But at the same time, you've seen, the worst levels of communitarian violence in Delhi in decades. You've seen India make a decision to pull out of the regional cooperative economic partnership, a rise in nationalism there that has led people to worry that India might be faltering. And it seems that at some level that this broader vision of multipolarity assumes a vibrant, growing, and increasingly interconnected India. So how do you deal with that, straw man or not?
Yeah, look, I would say that at one level it was a straw man, or even a kind of a hayman, which I kind of think is the mouldy version of straw that's been recycled, to argue that the book is all about India stepping into the role of regional saviour. I've got a lot of friends in India, a lot of respect for some things that India has done over the years and for the potential that India and Indian culture have to be really a net contributor to, I guess, all of our interests in the region. And it's worth remembering, as the book recounts, that a lot of the first efforts to build regional integration in Asia broadly came out of India in the 1940s. And then, of course, that story lost its way for many, many years. I don't think we can or should in any way downplay the problems within India and the self-harm that we're seeing inflicted on India's democratic values at the moment, because I think that is one of the potential strengths of India in the long run. Having said that, I guess I'd say a couple of things. One is the Indo-Pacific is not necessarily, and in my view, primarily about India spreading its wings across the broader region or globally. Even as India struggles, and we've got to remember that India has struggled before internally, in some aspects, India muddles through and fails every day, but it just keeps going. But even an India that doesn't reach its full potential is going to complicate life for China. And it's going to complicate life for China in precisely the areas, South Asia, the Indian Ocean, and indeed China's access to the Middle East and Africa, where China at the moment, and I think for many years to come, has built an increasing reliance on its supply chains and its regional relationships and its regional presence. So unless we saw China fundamentally withdraw, prematurely withdraw its neo-colonial project from the Indian Ocean and South Asia and Africa and the Middle East, then India is going to matter. And that's why I think the argument that somehow China and India will keep out of each other's way in a kind of spheres of interest or spheres of influence argument, I think is quite unrealistic. I'd also note that for many of us who watch India and cultivate the relationship with India over the years, India simply being itself, not an ally, but being a substantial rising power is going to be enough to have an impact on a multipolar order in the Indo-Pacific. I think in some ways, from an Australian perspective, Southeast Asia and Indonesia is going to be just as important in this Indo-Pacific story as is India, because of course Indo is in Indonesia as well, and indeed the very first use of the term Indo-Pacific, dating from around 1850, applied primarily to Indonesia rather than to India.
Well, thank you. I'm already sensing that one of the challenges of this format is I've now developed a list of 20 questions that I want to ask, but we're quickly coming up to our
You can edit me later, Gordon.
I've just got two quick questions, and then we'll kind of wrap up there. First, you referenced a U.S. edition of the book. So if you could kind of maybe give us a copy of that one or show us a copy of that one, and let us know your thinking behind having an Australian version or an Asian version of the U.S. version of the book.
The short and very pragmatic answer is that although I published this book with a fantastic Australian publisher, Black Ink and La Trobe University Press, their arrangement is to find an international publisher for the international rights. So I'm very proud to say that Manchester University Press have picked up the international edition and are launching it really at present. Of course, it's going to be virtual launches now in the UK, the US, and who knows where else. I'm still hoping that later in the year we'll get to editions in places like India, for example. And indeed, there is now a Chinese language edition on the way with a Taiwanese publisher. It'll be interesting to see if that one reaches the mainland or not. But your questions about the title, and the international publishers wanted a different title, that's fine. We agreed on Indo-Pacific Empire as the title because that captures the ambiguity of what China is about. It's not just the Chinese ambition for an Indo-Pacific empire, the Maritime Silk Road, but it's also the question mark over whether, in fact, other ambitions in the region, including America's over the years, have been imperial in character. But the subtitle of the thing has the word America in it, China, America, and the contest of the world's pivotal region. And I suspect that's partly to do with the fact that books with the word America in the title sell better in the United States. But I'd emphasise this is an international edition, not just an American edition. And I hope too, of course, that although I'm not going to be doing active book tours in the near future, and I suspect fewer people are going to be regularly visiting bookshops, that there'll be a lot of interest online, because I think a lot of what this book has to say really is beyond the parochialism of the year 2020. It's about the long arc of history.
Thanks. Now, one final question, if I might, to bring it back squarely here to Australia. When you launched your book formally in Canberra, the foreign minister sent out a tweet, and she said, regional players like Australia, not just global superpowers, can have a profound impact in shaping the future of the Indo-Pacific. And that seems to be at its core one of the themes of your book. So what are the implications of your core argument in the book for Australian foreign policy going forward?
So look, Australia has played, I think, a somewhat under-recognised role globally in managing the strategic order in our region in recent years, and I think into the future as well. There's sometimes a lack of confidence in Australian policy, and I do get pretty frustrated with some of the commentary that says we really need to have a much more active and creative policy. In fact, I think the last 5 years has seen a pretty significant set of measures. In fact, even the last 10 years has seen Australia really work very actively to lead not only a reimagining of the region, but the use of regional institutions to build new caucuses and new forms of consensus on issues ranging from what a rules-based order in the region looks like to the protection of the sovereignty and interests of small states. I think Australia's effort to assist our Pacific neighbours is obviously big in that regard. This, of course, runs up against the limits of the capabilities that a medium-sized power like Australia has. Yes, Australia is one of the top 20 economies in the world with one of the top 20 defence budgets, etc., etc. But at the same time, Australia's resources are finite and our interests are extensive. So a couple of observations there. One is that in the present, certainly the present era of crisis and self-reflection about policy everywhere, a lot of countries are going to be looking to adjust or moderate their ambitions and expectations. Australia needs to proceed very carefully in that regard because there's a lot that we can do with the resources that we have. And in some areas, such as diplomacy, such as development assistance, actually Australia is underinvested, and it's really worth investing in that space even now to play that trusted role as the region rebuilds itself going forward. Second point to note is that in making the argument about the Indo-Pacific that we're operating in this much bigger strategic space, you of course encounter the immediate counter-argument that, well, we don't have the resources to do that. The fact is no country does, and that's why the Indo-Pacific is in some ways a code for collective action, and it's a code for the need to build collective arrangements, sometimes including China, sometimes by China's choice, excluding China, but it's that premium on partnership that the Indo-Pacific is all about. That's where Australia has a good track record, has done creative work in recent years, including with our new minilateral arrangements with countries like India, Japan, Indonesia, and so forth, and where Australia should really now double down on its, I guess, on its core strength as a convener, as a trusted partner, not trying to do everything ourselves. Having said all of that, of course, a foundational strength in taking that approach going forward is ensuring we have resilience at home. And that's where, as I argue in the book, Australia does need to do better in harnessing the extraordinary capacity we have in this country, not just in the Commonwealth, but in the private sector, in civil society, in state governments, to build a more cohesive national effort for the national interest. So it's going to be a pretty testing couple of years, but I hope very much that Australia finding its home in the Indo-Pacific can help anchor us on that journey.
Well, thank you. The book is Contest for the Indo-Pacific, Why China Won't Map the Future by Professor Rory Medcalf at the Australian National University. We are delighted to have had a chance to have this conversation this morning. As I mentioned earlier, we'll put a hyperlink below where you can actually order a copy of the book. I presume it's also available electronically. While we've enjoyed this conversation, it's quickly apparent to me that my long list of 10 questions would be matched more by tremendous questions that I didn't even think of from our community. So we're going to be looking to interact more with Rory in the future, perhaps in a webinar format, so you can share some of those questions. But this is a good start for our effort to make sure that we continue a dialogue. And I can't think of a better way for us at the PerthUSAsia Center to start that out than with this conversation with Professor Rory Medcalf. Thank you, Rory. Appreciate it.
Thanks indeed, Gordon.